Hey guys, this is McTodgic, and welcome to another video of the Translucent Plastics Archive. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about the translucent Game Boy cartridges, and there's a lot to talk about here, and they have an interesting history which correlates quite well to the late 90s, early 2000s translucent trends, which I've already talked about, but I'm going to talk about more today. So, let's start back in the early 90s, or 1989 in particular, when we had the first Game Boy carts coming out. All Game Boy carts of the original Game Boy were beige, okay? Boring beige, just like all of computing, just like the Nintendo NES, the Super Nintendo, the N64 original one, of course, and Apple computers, all those things. Everything was beige. That was just the style. It was a little bit Cold War-ish. It was a bit quite depressing, but you would make up for it with the nice artwork, and that was just what you expected from the Game Boy carts. And it looked good with the original Game Boy because they were also beige, so it matched well. So this is Kirby's Dream Land, just an example of one of many games that back then was beige. Now when the Game Boy Color came out, they started to release these games which were compatible with the original Game Boy and with the Game Boy Color. For example, Shadowgate Classic. What this meant was that if you played it on a Game Boy, you'd get black and white, but if you played it on a Game Boy Color, you'd get color inside the game. These were just, you could tell these by their black cartridge, so just a small design change, just so you knew that it was a compatible game of Game Boy and Game Boy Color. And another example of this, which was compatible with both, was Pokemon Gold Edition. And you can see that they put a little bit more effort into this cartridge and started to make something a bit more of a design choice. It's kind of got this shiny gold veneer, and of course the cartridge itself is gold. There was another example of this a little bit earlier, but that was Pokemon Yellow. And also Donkey Kong, I think it was, also came in a yellow cartridge like this, because bananas were such a big part of that game. So that's Pokemon Yellow there. But let's talk a little bit more about the Game Boy Color, because that's where things started to change. You see, in terms of the actual Game Boys, which I've already talked about, the first translucent Game Boy was the Game Boy Pocket. There was also a clear version of the original Game Boy, but yeah, the first translucent colored one was the Game Boy Pocket. And then when the Game Boy Color came out, it really reached the mainstream with the Atomic Purple color. Game Boy Color games were transparent in a frosted sort of gray color. Here's an example. This is Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. A very good game if you haven't played it. A really nice little RPG, actually. Quite different to the other Philosopher's Stones games from the time. So you can see that it's just cased in a very, very subtle grey housing, grey translucent housing. You can really just see the PCB, so it's kind of cool. You can really see what's going on inside of it. And there's a small bump at the top here, which if you've used a Game Boy Color, you know, that's just to prevent you from putting this into a original Game Boy. So that's Game Boy Color games. But there actually were 3 games, I think, that also were translucent and more interesting in color. And here's one of them. This is Kirby Tilt and Tumble, or in Japanese, Koro Koro Kirby. It's in pink, which is really nice, nicely matches the Kirby theme. Interestingly though, the very original Kirby, which you'll actually see here, have a look at this again. Do you notice anything? The original Kirby was not actually pink, but actually white. But about a year or two after they first came out with this Kirby game, they changed their mind and decided that they would make Kirby pink, you know, cuddly and pink. And so when they released this Koro Koro Kirby, they came out in a translucent pink housing. This is an interesting cart. It's a little bit different in shape to others, and that's because it has a tilt meter. It can detect tilting, because this game was all about tilting. You know, you actually held the Game Boy and it actually could detect if you moved it up and down, it would detect and move Kirby up and down as follows. So that was part of the reason why they came out with a special housing and a translucent case for this game in color. There was one other game that had a tilting mechanism and had a similar cart. It was called Command Master, and that came in a blue housing, but I don't have that. But yeah, the 3, if you're wondering what translucent colors there were for Game Boy Color, typically you would have, this would be a standard Game Boy Color game, just it's essentially clear, really, but a bit of gray. Then you had Kirby as one outlier, the only pink Game Boy Color game in translucent, and Command Master, which I don't have, which is also a blue kind of tint. And then the last one, of course, is Pokemon Crystal, which is, well, perhaps one of my favorite games of all time. Pokemon Crystal comes in this really nice teal housing, and has got a bit of a sparkle to it as well. It's really special. But if you're looking for the most aesthetic of all games cartridges, you actually need to find the Japanese version, which has this really nice emblem on the back and has a different kind of PCB. So there was a little bit more design on that one. The reason that this is so special as well is because this was meant to be the last Pokemon game. Essentially, Pokemon was meant to end at Generation 2, and this was meant to be the last game. It was really a perfection of the Pokemon format, the Pokemon genre, and it's unfortunate, well, maybe not unfortunate, but it's sort of interesting that they decided to continue the franchise and, well, probably to make money, I suppose. But Crystal was meant to be the last game, and they did put so much effort into this, and the translucent casing was just a really nice sign of the early 2000s as the translucent era was at its peak. When you get to the Game Boy Advance, they go back to opaque again, and you have a few games that are a little bit translucent, like if you look at Pokemon Fire Red. If you look very carefully, you can very faintly see the PCB there, just through the red, but it's not very clear anymore. And this game is from, 2004, I think? 2003, whatever. And you can tell that the design trend of translucent plastics has come to an end because the Game Boy Advance itself didn't really use much translucent plastic anymore. There was no Atomic Purple Game Boy Advance. And so it was really the end of the era by this point. And when you get to the Nintendo DS, there's absolutely no hint anymore of anything clear. And only with the new 2DS, I think it was, where Nintendo released a transparent housing, and that was obviously for nostalgia reasons. But really, the peak of the era of translucence was the Game Boy Color, which perfectly fits with the late 90s and the release of the iMac G3 and all of those great things which were happening at that time in terms of design. So there you go, that's the Game Boy cartridges. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Translucent Plastics Archive, and stick around for more.